right. Welcome everyone to our session that's called Europe from Cake to Coffee. And how we'll have this work today, and we have three really interesting papers, very different papers, but all just really fascinating. I enjoyed all three of them very much. And how we're going to do this today, I think, is we'll go ahead and have everyone present, all three present, and then we'll come back to questions after that instead of doing so we can make sure everybody has enough time for questions. All right, so our first presenter is from here at Ferris State University. His name is Jonny Parshall, and his title of his paper is He Always Burns the Cakes, Exploring the King Alfred Enigma. You go now, yeah.
I'm going to utilize this. I'll put it back when I'm done. Nope, wrong end. That's actually not as high as I thought it would be. Can everyone see this area right here? Okay, I thought there's all 8 people doing. What's coming over for you? He always burns the cake, exploring the King Alfred Enigma. I desire to live worthily as long as I lived, and to leave after my life to the men who should come after me the memory of me in good works. Quotes Alfred the Great in his preface to the translation of Constellation of Philosophy by Boethius. Alfred the Great cast an undeniable shadow over British history. Legends surround the Anglo-Saxon king. He united the broken English kingdoms against the conquering Danes and banished the horde from the English shores. He commissioned the construction of the first English navy. He served as a pious figure in the English Catholic Church and published many ecclesiastical works. He created the first system of parliament, and of course, there was that time he let a peasant woman's cakes burn at the fire when he was supposed to be watching them. Or at least, these claims are how we remember him. In 2002, the BBC conducted a poll of the 100 greatest Britons to have ever lived. Alfred the Great ranked 14th on the list, the second highest monarch next to only Elizabeth I. It has been more than 1,100 years since his death, and yet he is in constant discussion and admiration. Why? What is remarkable about Alfred that allows his persona to loom over the 58 English and British monarchs that succeeded him, not to mention the thousands of dukes, knights, generals, admirals, ministers, prime ministers, scientists, inventors, explorers, activists, television presenters, and pop stars? So let's look at the sources first. There are 3 primary sources that lend to us the picture history has painted of the warrior king: Asser's Life of Alfred, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and Alfred's own writings. As historians, we lack lengthy records from employed nobles, foreign dignitaries, or contemporary scholars to cross-examine these 3 works. Indeed, everything we know of Alfred was, disputably, written under the supervision of his court, and very likely the king himself. It is from this limited pool that all succeeding scholars have had to base an opinion on the King of Wessex, and in turn on the validity of the sources themselves. Yet these sources often lack a concrete narrative, leaving much for interpretation, and interpreting Alfred is something historians have been trying to do for more than 1,000 years. In analyzing these accounts of Alfred by latter-day scholars, we discover that historians reflecting on the 9th century king often reflected their own time periods and biases as well. In the mind of English historian Charles Plummer, the first authority in Alfred's accounts is Alfred himself. Unfortunately, and perhaps an act of modesty, Alfred recorded little account of himself or his deeds. King Alfred was assisted by his monk assistant Asser and Grimbald of St. Britons, and translated St. Gregory's Pastoral Care, Boethius's Constellations, St. Augustine's Soliloquies, and no doubt other works of scholarship. Charters of his political and legal actions were poorly preserved. Many of his title deeds were destroyed, some of which by marauding Danes attempting land claims. Also surviving is Alfred's will, which outlines the reasons he succeeded his brother Ethelred to the West Saxon Kentish throne in favor of his elder brother's son. That's about it on his behalf. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, number 2, is one of the most studied accounts of early medieval history, and the second most complete account of King Alfred besides Asser's Life of Alfred. It is the first British historical account not written in Latin. The Chronicle exists in 9 known manuscripts, each copied from earlier versions with few contradictions between them. Many scholars accept the theory Alfred supervised its creation himself, though British conservative politician and amateur historian Sir Henry Howarth expressed low opinion of it. The Chronicle illustrates many of the highlights of Alfred's career, but is likewise brief, often skipping accounts of multiple consecutive years and places. Though considered the most accurate register of Alfred, the Chronicle did not paint a complete enough picture to base the public opinion of the hero king developed since. The most famous first-hand account of Alfred is also the most dubious. Number 3, Astor's Life of Alfred. It is here from which we receive the legendary Alfred. Plummer refers to Astor's life as the greatest crux in our whole subject. We know very little of Astor. He seemed to spend more time writing of the king than himself. He was raised and educated in Wales, ordained at St. David's, and later became Bishop of Sherborne. That's all we know. Many historians since the 19th century have expressed their view that Astor's life is likely a later forgery, including notable historian Alfred Smythe's hypothesis of the document's creation in the early 11th century by Bert Firth of Ramsey. Despite its inaccuracies, Plummer, Abels, and many other modern scholars believe Astor's life to be authentic and invaluable as long as it is used critically. The primary complaint against Astor's life is our own inability to examine his work. The last known contemporary manuscript perished in the Cottonian fire of 1731. We are utmost dependent on Francis Wise's 1722 edition, which Plummer notes for having been tampered with by editors at the time. These editors also included notes from the transposer that resulted in many befuddled scholars oftentimes quoting the editors and misquoting Astor. This lack of an original copy has added support to the belief that Astor's work was a forgery. Richard Abels has expressed a lack of persuasion by Smythe's accusation of fraudulence, and Plummer states that despite inaccuracies on the part of Astor, multiple logical conclusions do not confirm an act of forgery. It's a matter of opinion. In Alfred Smythe's Alfred the Great, the author proposes Astor's life was a letter-day forgery. This was by no means a new revelation when published in 1997, but it was by Smythe the idea received more recent leverage in modern scholarly communities. Even Plummer agrees 100 years earlier that features of Alfred's life indeed excite suspicion. The goal of Astor's work, if genuine, was not historical objectivity or accuracy, but a celebration of the king. Less of a documentary, more of a television commercial. There are multiple arguments against Astor that inspired the monk's largest critics. The first matter of argument is inconsistency. Life of Alfred is organized very loosely, which to Abels implies a work in progress rather than a completed draft. The order of events depicted by Astor do not link with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or other chronicles of the time, as if portions of Alfred's history were, as Abels puts, placed in a hat and drawn in any order at which chance might dictate. Another suspicious tendency Plummer incites of Astor is the monk's constant insistence having witnessed events firsthand. Astor mentions having seen Alfred's skill in hunting, Alfred's mysterious attacks of illness, his surveying the site of the fort at Kinnuit, the Salday Thorn which marked the site of the Battle of Ashdod, and many other events, each time with the author's own eye. I saw it with mine own eye, he said. Plummer believes it is this constant asseveration that excites suspicion, and it is more likely Astor compiled many first-hand experiences from others, assuming credit to bolster his claim, sort of like a medieval Gilderoy Lockhart for those Rolling fans. Another argument made by historians against Astor is the liberal use of Frankish, Old French words and figures of speech in Wise's transposition. An argument can be made that either these are contaminations by Wise or other later scribes, or evidence of fraud, depending on the reader's viewpoint. Plummer believes that these well may be not contaminations at all, but actual influences on Astor and King Alfred through multiple channels, namely Alfred's Frankish in-laws and Alfred's brother Athelwulf's Frankish secretary. Astor's modern-day editors, Cambridge's professor of Anglo-Saxon, Simon Keynes, and professor of medieval Latin, Michael Abridge, believe that we should resist the temptation to regard it as a form of West Saxon dynastic propaganda. From Alfred's works, the Chronicle, and Astor's life, we receive 3 different Alfreds: a king of whom we know a little, a king we think a bit, a king we think we know a bit, and a king at whom we guess a lot, respectively. Alfred and his Saxon kingdom have not always been depicted in a positive manner. For many centuries, scholars such as David Hume depicted Saxons as heathen barbarians who drink from the skulls of defeated enemies. Alfred's achievements were often overlooked in favor of Norman and pre-Saxon British heroes such as the legendary King Arthur. And the go-to chronicler of great English deeds came from Geoffrey of Monmouth, Arthur's biographer. Alfred and the Anglo-Saxons would earn little credit until the 1670 publishing of John Milton's History of Britain. Milton was a celebrity writer of history, politics, poetry, prose, best remembered for his biblical allegory, Paradise Lost, some of which you may have read, I would like to think. Milton was a believer in liberal Whig philosophy, set around a belief in weak constitutional monarchy, and a supporter of Cromwell during the English Civil War. Milton originally planned to center his epic History of Britain around Arthur, but during research immediately recognized the doubtful historicity of Geoffrey of Monmouth's work. Instead, Milton dedicated 4 of his 6 books in the first volume to the Anglo-Saxons, from the beginnings of Britain through the unification under Alfred to the death of the last Saxon king, Harold Godwinson. Milton planned for further volumes, but died. In another work, Commonplace Book, Milton said of the ancient king, Alfred turned the old laws into English. I would he lived now to rid us of this Norman gibberish. Though Cromwell's republic failed and the Stuart monarchy was restored, Milton's influence with history and other major work was detrimental to the old beliefs of balanced power in the United Kingdom. By the 18th century, the legend of King Arthur passed out of history and into mythology. Pro-Saxon notions were reintroduced by Milton, and the history of Britain had sown a seed of nationalism that in the following century would bloom. Claiming Anglo-Saxon origins by the 18th century had become a seal of prestige. To strengthen their legitimacy and Englishness in the midst of skeptics and supporters of the deposed Stuarts, the Hanovers adopted many Anglo-Saxon customs and imageries. Victoria's marriage to Albert was considered a rightful return of Saxon blood to Britain's throne, Albert being of German descent, according to historian Joanne Parker. In 1868, sculptor William Thede the Younger unveiled the official marble statue of Queen Victoria and her German husband, Prince Albert, as depicted heroes. The royal couples are depicted not in typical 19th century fashion, but in traditional Saxon dress, further symbolizing Britain's Saxon heritage. Legendary Anglo-Saxons transcended their barbaric status put forth by earlier writers and became the nation's heroes. According to Oxford historian and liberal politician Edward A. Freeman, there is no hero in all of history more perfect, he uses the word perfect, than King Alfred the Great. The national obsession with Alfred the Great and the Anglo-Saxons seemed to accelerate in the 19th century. William Burgess's portrait of Alfred at Worcester College Chapel in Cambridge is depicted among notable saints of the period in his tile mosaic. The king is depicted crowned and holding a book, possibly a Bible or his famous missal, and scepter. Burgess presents Alfred and the Anglo-Saxons, look at that, look what just happened, in a manner interpretable as foundation for Christianity in England. Late 19th century witnessed promotions of religious renewal, especially old concepts sympathetic to Roman Catholicism. Artist Paul Gavarni's engravings, as depicted here, published in the only issue of the journal, The Anglo-Saxon, may be strong artistic examples of the Anglo-Saxon zeitgeist that swept 19th century Britain. Gavarni's engravings, if a bit tongue-in-cheek, compare a fierce Saxon warrior of the 5th century to a well-to-do Victorian aristocrat land speculator in equal regards. Hamill Thornycraft's statue, installed at Winchester Cathedral in 1901, marked the 1000th anniversary of Alfred's death. Alfred holds his sword point down, forming a cross. This could be interpreted as representing Alfred's willingness to defend Christianity from heathens through force. In Plummer's The Life and Times of Alfred the Great, published 1 year after the millenary, that being his 1000th anniversary, the author notes how there has been a boom in all things Alfredian lately, and the literary speculator has rushed in to make his profit. Joanne Parker patiently tallied up the various works dedicated to the Saxon king, calculating at least 4 statues, more than 25 paintings, more than 100 Alfredian texts, including at least 22 poems, 16 plays, 11 novels, 12 histories, and 4 children's books published in that decade. The King Alfred Millenary in 1901 celebration in Winchester was arguably the peak of Great Britain's Alfredian and Anglo-Saxon intrigue. Attending the event were such notable figures as Rudyard Kipling, Thomas Hardy, Poet Laureate Alfred Austin, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle christened the event with a speech detailing Alfred's accomplishments, referring to the ancient king as Saint Alfred, and remarking, as a warrior, as a lawgiver, as an organizer, he was an Englishman at his best. And if we can believe the story of the burnt cakes, even in the small matter of cooking, he was but a representative of his race. That being the English pork roast. 98 years later, after the 1901 millenary, exhibitions and conferences were once again held in Winchester and Southampton to mark the 1100th anniversary of the King's death in 899, though with brief discussions and exhibitions modest in comparison. To commemorate the event, historian Barbara York published an article in the publication History Today titled Alfred the Great, the Most Perfect Man in History. The title is a reference to Edward Freeman's claims in his History of the Norman Conquest of England series of Alfred being the most perfect character in history. York states that Alfred's reputation was still very high among historians in 1999, but perfect is perhaps a statement too bold. That said, what do we know of the man? What we're sure about Alfred is the most basic information from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which we can confirm. Alfred was born in 849 CE. He was the fifth son born to King Ethelwulf of Wessex and Kent and his first wife Osburh. At a young age, Alfred accompanied his father on a pilgrimage to Rome, where, according to the Chronicle, Alfred was blessed by Pope Leo IV as the future King of Wessex and Kent, despite having 3 older surviving eligible brothers. While the two were away, Alfred's eldest brother, Ethelbald, deposed their father as king in Wessex. On their return in 856, Ethelbald refused to vacate the throne, and so Ethelwulf and Alfred returned to Kent, where Ethelwulf named second son Ethelbert heir. After the deaths of Ethelwulf in 858 and Ethelbald in 860, a unified Wessex and Kent fell to Ethelbert, who then died 865. You following this? Alfred fought the Vikings during the massive Viking invasions with his last remaining brother, King Ethelred, until the latter's death in 871. And then Alfred became king. These are matters of general agreement and most likely truth. They do not, however, tell us much of what Alfred did during his reign as king. The events that came after his coronation have been a matter of debate among scholars since the 17th century and are a strong example of how historians often depict Alfred. The most significant events of Alfred's life can be argued the ones common people remember best and the ones scholars debate the most. Perhaps the most endearing folk tale involving King Alfred is the story of the burnt cakes. Simply perform an internet engine search and the most popular reference will likely be this incident. By 878, Danes had overrun and occupied Wessex. Alfred's forces are broken and scattered, and Alfred and a small band were forced into hiding in the marshlands of Somerset. While his men were busy building fortifications in a cottage on higher ground in the small village of Athelney, Alfred was resting in the cottage of a swineherd after some chronic bouts of ill health. Modern historians theorize it may have likely been Crohn's disease. The swineherd's wife had placed some cakes, loaves of dense bread rather, and on the hearth to bake, and asked the ailing Alfred to watch them while she left the house on an errand. His mind and body duly distressed, Alfred failed at this task, and the loaves burned, as one might expect. The woman returned home, and upon discovering the state of things, scolded the troubled king without pity, not really truly knowing who he was, what he was facing. A rendition is King Alfred in the Nether's Cottage by Scottish artist David Wilkie. The cottager's wife berates the incognito Alfred for burning the cakes, though his body is famished and his mind is busy planning military response to the Danish invasion. The family portrayed what happened with the cakes as an utter tragedy, unaffected by major military or political turmoil that surrounds them. The story of the cakes, though included in many later copies of Astor's Life of Alfred, was actually the creation of a 10th century chronicler. While this fable enlightens us to how far Alfred fell as king during the Danish invasions, typically all scholars disagree it actually happened, or at least have no evidence of the event. Alfred is remembered today as the founder of the English and later British Navy. The National Museum of the Royal Navy at Portsmouth today recognizes this achievement, officially stating no navy or fleet existed in any shape or form in England until the reign of King Alfred. In 878, Alfred went out to sea with a raiding ship army, says the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and fought against 7 shiploads and captured one of them and put the others to flight. This is the first account of an English Navy sea battle. Early accounts in 833 and 840 recall battles by Kings Ecgbert and Ethelwulf, respectively, against Viking raiders measured in shiploads, yet do not use language specific enough to determine if these battles were on land or sea. Another account in 851 depicts Alfred's brother Athelstan fighting the Danes, and you'd think they'd get more original with these names, capturing 9 ships near Sandwich. While the Winchester manuscripts recounts this battle in the same language as the 833 and 840 battles, the Peterborough manuscript specifies that Athelstan and the Danes fought in ships. If the Peterborough version is to be trusted, it might mean that we can apply the same logic to the earlier battles by Egbert and Ethelwulf. Therefore, Alfred was likely not the first English king to champion an English navy, but at best the second, possibly the fourth. Many attribute Alfred's use of the Wittenagament or Witten as a precursor to modern parliament. What we know is Alfred reorganized the country into shires, hundreds, and tithings. The idea of a code or body of statutes covering all departments of civil life was quite foreign to the notions of the Anglo-Saxons. It is quite possible Alfred's laws did not pass until late in his career. The pieces we do have depict Alfred's wish unlike the parliament-minded portrayal of the 19th century and more like an absolutist monarchy. These are the best illustration of Alfred's Witten we have, as charters are few. As before I said, the Danes destroyed them to claim land. Says Plummer, the Chronicle does not mention a single meaning of the Witten, and though it may be wrong to argue from this silence, for it's the same is true of many other reigns, yet it is probable that the circumstance of the time combined proportionally the importance of the Witten testament. John Milton, in his anti-Charles I sentiment Iconoclast, cites the Stuart king's abuse of power and negligence of Parliament as several means, among others, for execution. He references Alfred's semi-annual meeting of the Witten in contrast to Charles' call for Parliament every 3 years, and indirectly quotes Alfred's own clause that the king should be as liable and obedient to suffer right as the others of his people, like Nixon. Bernard Cornwell's fictional novel, The Pale Horseman, is a recently depicted example of Alfred and Astor in popular culture. The New York Times best-selling novel, adapted to the BBC Netflix television series The Last Kingdom, depicts Alfred engaged in many popular folklore exploits, such as the burning of the cakes, the great king's guise as a minstrel spying on Saxons. Astor is depicted as a strange British monk, cowardly, superstitious, afraid of women, other clergymen depicted similarly. These representations support the lasting impression folklore creates in contrast to scholarly history. The scholars may debate what Alfred did, but there is little argument over what sort of man he was. Astor's Alfred is a wise, victorious warrior king, in love with piety, devotion, truth, wisdom, and knowledge, and friendly to lowly servants and enemy Viking warlords alike. To Charles Plummer, Alfred holds in history the place which romance assigns to Arthur. Alfred Smythe believes him to be no ordinary man, but a gifted ruler who was himself ever concerned with how we in succeeding generations would view him. Richard Abels remembers him as a warrior scholar who preserved his kingdom against invasion, promoted learning, and began a process that would culminate in the creation of the Kingdom of England. After centuries of scholarly research of who Alfred might have been, we still perceive him through an opaque screen, able to recognize a general outline, but little detail. What we discover through this analysis is the importance of timing. King Alfred holds in real history King Alfred exists in a narrow window of British history that lies at the beginning of modern English history and at the end of early British legend. He exists within the realm of legend, his achievements too speculative and shrouded in myth. King Arthur exists within the realm of legend, his achievements too speculative and shrouded in myth. King Richard III exists within the historical record, his every flaw and crime bare to the ever-critical eye of historians. But Alfred lived long enough ago that his faults have been dismissed, forgiven, or forgotten. Yet his achievements are rooted enough in history that colorful embellishments can be praised as potentially factual. He is the perfect king because he lived in that perfect window of time. And while he was no doubt great, he is only Alfred the Great because the British and English-speaking peoples wanted him to be. In short, he fit a bill that few else could. Regardless of what historians believe Alfred did or did not do, folklore dictates his reputation to the common person, you and I, not scholarly debate. It is that reason why he is always the Alfred we want him to be and is remembered as, regardless of time period. He always invents the navy, parliament, and trial by jury. He always translates Latin scripture and writes new laws. He always carves white horses into the landscape and sneaks into Danish camps disguised as a minstrel. And of course, he always burns the goddamn cakes. How was I on time?
Well, I hope you liked that video. Feel free to leave a comment below telling us what you think or would like to see in any future videos. And be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons. And stay tuned for more great content from Mortar and Ivy, preserving the culture and class of our glorious past.